Right. Now, just to give you a little bit of background about Mairon Bastos Lima. Mairon Bastos Lima is a senior research fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, SEI, in Sweden. He holds a PhD in environmental studies from UV University Amsterdam and has worked for nearly 20 years on the policy and governance dimensions of sustainable development. Mairon's research focuses on the relationships between sustainable development and agri-food systems, supply chain sustainability, and the bioeconomy. I really love his bioeconomy work. It's pretty great, but I'm not sure he's talking about that tonight. His work has especially addressed international policy dynamics in relation to domestic agendas and environmental change in the global south. I'm really excited for the talk this evening. Mairon, I hand the microphone over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Christian, and thanks everybody for taking the time to come here today. I'm very honored with the invitation to speak to this group and very flattered to know that my work is going to be helping the students next semester in their course. I hope they'll find it provoking, as I hope you will find this talk interesting. And it's probably too much of a pun to say that it will give you food for thought. This probably happens every month. But today I thought I would link it to various pieces of the work I have done over the years, both on the food consumption side and on the land use side, because I probably don't have to tell this group that everything is connected in that realm of agri-food systems. But I thought I would take the Amazonian case as an emblematic one, it being most likely the most emblematic terrestrial ecosystem on the planet, in a place that is hardly known, even though it's probably the most famous ecosystem, one of the few that go by a proper name, you know. It's not just the Congo Basin or Southeast Asia. It's a specific place with a whole history, with its Greek name. It's very famous, especially across the Western world, and yet it's seldom understood in its diversity, either biological or cultural. So I thought I would bring that closer to home and speak in greater detail about how it's connected to, guess what, how we eat or how we can eat. So let's get started. I don't think anybody here will disagree that we as a society live on increasingly monotonous diets. Perhaps there are exceptions in this group of foodies, but broadly speaking, especially those of us living in high income countries, have got to have, well, have come to have increasingly boring diets. These are FAO numbers, except those on the number of species. Those are from the biologists. But 3/4 of the plant-derived energy of the calories we take come from only 6 species that you probably eat, at least some of them on a daily basis. Most people do. Most of them are basically carbs with chiefly protein crop and sugar cane, which is basically to sweeten our fizzy drinks and the industrialized sweets that are abundant in the food shelves. And basically, the vast majority of the world's flora is not utilized, even though there are thousands, indeed tens of thousands of plants that are considered edible, and hundreds of which have been cultivated and used, not to speak of their varieties. Think of apple, think of bananas. There are so many varieties of the same species. And most of those varieties are disappearing. Some of them have already stopped being cultivated. And when it comes to animal food too, it's only a few species that dominate. How come we've come to this point? When we speak of biodiversity, too often we forget about agrobiodiversity and our role in supporting that. Of course, this phenomenon has come hand in hand with the increase, dangerously so, of ultra-processed foods or highly processed foods, especially in highly industrialized countries, where we've come with an endless assortment of fake food diversity. Basically, you have artificial flavoring to replace the lack of natural flavor use. I think most of you get what ultra processed refers to, but I have left that description, that definition there that will strike home for many of you, and they are things we typically find on many food labels. But basically, we've come up with different ways to combine starches, proteins, maybe vegetable oils. Palm oil might be the seventh or the eighth most consumed crop, and it's not just for cosmetics, with artificial flavoring. So you have different combinations of that. Many people for instance, in the North American context, have pointed out how you have entire corridors, entire aisles in the supermarket devoted to breakfast cereal. Basically, you have what? Sugar, corn, and then a plethora of chemicals that are used to trick your tongue. Um, I remember when I lived in Canada many years ago, and I'm Brazilian myself, and I was used to ice cream flavors that are made from fruits, basically. And there I encountered funny flavors like birthday cake, moose tracks. I remember once buying one called Rainbow, which had different colors. And basically, the vast majority of them were just combinations of starch, fat, some oil. This is what has come to take the place at the table of so many of us. You see there that in countries like the US or the UK that have the most industrialized food systems, it's already more than half. In the case of children in the UK, it's 59%, if I remember correctly. That's pretty disturbing. For those of you from other countries, I thought I would bring this table so that you can find the country where you live or where you're from. They're not all there, of course, but there is a bunch of them in Latin America or Europe. Um, you might want to be on the losing end, in quotes, on the left-hand side. But that's increasing, even in places that are not high income, such as Latin American countries like Colombia and Brazil. It's still increasing quite substantially if you compare to how it was a generation or two ago. So those of us in Latin America are also subjected to the same trends. You see that in the US, it's almost 60%. What we must not forget is that what we eat shapes faraway landscapes. You don't need to go that far, though I quite typically, my friends will remind me, like to go far. So if I take you back 500 years ago with the colonization of the Americas, basically you had countries such as my home one, Brazil, being occupied with sugarcane plantations for the sake of European tastes that had gotten a flavor of the Indian crop and decided that they wanted more of it without having to go all the way to Asia to pick it up. So suddenly you had vast expanses of South American estate that had been covered with the Atlantic rainforest giving way to sugarcane monocropping. Fast forward to the present, we still have countries whose economies are very dependent on coffee, tea, cocoa. Some of them support decent work, but others don't. Of course, by now, many people's livelihoods have come to be intertwined with the cultivation of those crops. Um, I thought I would throw in some numbers just for a reference, because if you take cocoa, for example, for which Europe is by far the largest consumer, it's actually more of a consumer of cocoa than the rest of the world combined. And most cocoa, for those of you who don't know, come from West Africa, especially Ivory Coast or Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And even there, even those that are certified, they still do not earn much. So some of those labels may do some good, but they do not erase systemic imbalances that exist in the value chains of food. And in that regard, I much prefer to speak of value chain than supply chain, precisely because it highlights how value distribution, how value aggregation is different at different stages. And coming from a country where the economy began developing as a raw material exporter, I do not like the idea of being perpetually in that role. So I tend to much prefer development promotion, not necessarily through foreign aid and that kind of development promotion, but every economic link nowadays, at least in theory, has a view to promoting development, or so we like to believe, in some form. And I think we don't go very far if we only think of global South countries participating as raw material providers, while much of the value addition in cocoa, for example, takes place in Belgium or Switzerland. It's fine if the Swiss and Belgians keep to their expertise in making great chocolate, but I would love to see folks in Ghana and the Ivory Coast also moving out of poverty rather than staying where they are because of the history they had. But anyway, I I think it's clear that our consumption is linked to that. The other point I wanted to make here is that those landscapes look like that because many of us with enough in our pockets to influence where investments go have come to enjoy the taste of these funky tropical crops, tropical in the case of coffee and cocoa, but also um, the tea crop um, outside of the tropics, as in the tropics too, that, some people have found it worthwhile to devote thousands of hectares to them because there are people who will buy. But why is it that we stay hooked on only few crops? We should be able to amplify our tastes um, if we perhaps give more value to tastes that come from nature rather than let ourselves be fooled by artificial flavoring. Let's move ahead. These are landscapes that involve people and livelihoods and that create jobs, but that's obviously not the case for all those six plants that dominate our food system. Some landscapes get to look like this. This is a soy plantation. Soy is one of the world's most traded commodities. It depends on how you measure. It might be the first one. In Brazil, it is definitely the first one. It is one of the country's top three export products. To get the only one that is an agricultural one. The other ones happen to be oil and iron ore. Our area keeps growing and now is about nearly twice the size of the UK. It's a lot of land. It's a lot of land dedicated to a single crop. It's quite fascinating. And then some of those folks that like to view the plant as a selfish gene or something like that say, well, this is a very successful story for Glycine max. But anyway, we as Homo sapiens are not, or have some grievances with the fact that Glycine max has expanded too much, or that we expanded it too much. Because in the case of a crop like soy, which in Brazil is typically intercropped with maize, for the record. So it's the two of them, even though soy is the most valuable one of the two, and the one that basically will carry things forward from an economic sense. It creates very few jobs. It's less than one person per hectare. It's not a chance that you don't see anybody on that field, save for the owner of those cute hens that are there for the photo effect. And it's a highly consolidated sector. We don't really have truly small holders. You have mid-sized and large-sized farmers linked to a very oligopolistic trader space where basically a handful of companies dominate the trading of soy, mainly in the case of Brazil, mainly to China. But China is the major consumption of soy. So it's not all about Europe. I don't mean to be Eurocentric here for a second. China is a major consumer, and that goes mostly to animal feed. And again, this skirts around Europe. Europe still is the second buyer for the record, the EU as a whole, and even more if you count the UK and all of Europe in. But basically, once again, it is expanding and it has quadrupled since 1990. Many of us were already born by then. We remember 1990, some of us. And within this space, bam, twice the size of the UK has radically changed what it looks like. I like to point out how land use change is a faster environmental issue than climate change, because in the case of climate change, we frequently refer to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and these things that even our grandparents didn't get to see, whereas this has been happening within our lifetimes. Let's finally get to the Amazon. It has been experiencing from almost every side what I sometimes nickname a ground assault. You see there in the Brazilian part, and Brazil is about 60%, has about 60% of the Amazon. You see what we typically call the arc of deforestation. Think of a crescent there in the southern part and eastern part of the Amazon, though you also see deforestation frontiers in places like Colombia, Peru, and currently Bolivia, which is the one that the Amazonian country experiencing the fastest conversion rate. It's just that it's smaller than Brazil. But in relative terms, it's a more active frontier. But there is a lot. You have the biodiversity, but you also have tens of millions of people, most of them live in cities, but you do have a presence of rural communities of all sorts, traditional people, riverside, riverine communities, Afro-Brazilian quilombola communities, indigenous communities of hundreds of different nations and language groups, and so forth. And that's the space, amongst others. I will focus on the Amazon for focus sake, but the Cerrado in Brazil, which is, well, to the south east of the Amazon, has also been experienced, and it's even more wiped out. Let's focus on the Amazon. I can go on the Cerrado if you want during the Q&A. But it's been experiencing that, and the rate has fluctuated over the years. It's been going up and down. Most of you know the story of how from 2004, with President Lula in power for the first time and his then environment minister, Marina Silva, that is now again the environment minister, and not coincidentally, deforestation rates are going down once more. They went down in the 2000s, then they started going up before Bolsonaro, the famous one, took power. But of course, he being in office with a ministry that was basically phasing out or clamping down on environmental controls brought the rates up, as you can see there. This figure doesn't have it yet, but about a month ago, we got the 2024 numbers, and it's gone down again, I think by 30 something percent to about 6,000 square kilometers cleared. It's nice that it's going down, but we must not forget that this is cumulative. It's still nearly 4 times the Greater London area that is wiped out from January, I don't know what you were doing, to the end of this year. It's actually calculated from the middle of the year to the middle of the year for various reasons, but it's still in the space of 12 months. And this keeps going. And most of you will have heard of the tipping point where scientists think that The Amazon may cross it at some point in the future. We don't know exactly where then the remaining vegetation will fail to create enough evapotranspiration for the rains that sustain it. And now, already for 2 years in a row, we have been having very wicked droughts, which are still happening right now. The images are quite heartbreaking because you see dried rivers, dried to the bottom with thousands, tens of thousands of fish dead. And now some areas, because typically what would happen in the Amazon is that it is um, it is cleared and then set on fire. But now, because it is so dry, even the standing forest is burning much more easily, which is basically accelerating the process in a wicked way. So we need to act quickly. This is what it gets to look like. I wish I encountered this photo today, actually. It's very fresh. So it is from this drought, it's from this year. I wish it had been created by AI or something like that, but it's not. This is what the Amazon gets to look like. Now this photo and the upcoming ones are by myself, taken last year from southern Pará, where it once had rainforest, and after fires, after clearing, after selective logging, you basically have the vegetation looking like this and like this. Uh, it's not Arizona or Namibia or any dry place on Earth. It's the greatest rainforest on the planet under a changed climate, and most of all, under a changed local climate because of the deforestation and the replacement of its vegetation for brachiaria and other forms of grass used for cattle ranching. And that is because cattle ranching is what spearheads Amazon deforestation. So here I have to make an interesting caveat because cattle ranching, which is the world's largest driver of tropical deforestation, for the record, it alone is about half of the world's tropical deforestation and two-thirds of it in Latin America. In Brazil, we have as many heads of cattle as we have people. And in the Amazon, we have 3 times as many cattle as we have people, almost 100 million. That alone is as large as the US cattle herd, for example. And then most of it is consumed domestically. If you work with supply chain sustainability, you perhaps know this, that very little of it is exported to the EU, even a tiny amount. It's even less than 1% to the UK. Some of it goes to China, Middle Eastern countries, and Russia import part of it, but most of it is consumed domestically. You will remember that I said a few minutes ago that what we eat has defined, in many cases, the fate of landscapes, what they get to look like, more so than what local people often want to do, because typically you have a local elite that basically responds to that demand and decide to produce in a large scale a certain good, maybe involving locals, maybe not, through job creation. But in the case of cattle, it is different because it's not simply that Brazilians eat a lot of meat. Actually, on a per capita basis, despite the fame that South America has as a big meat eater, Brazilians do eat a lot of meat. But on a per capita basis, places in a country like the US, Australia, I think France. France is the biggest in Europe. I don't have the exact number on the top of my head, but I know that some of these other countries do eat more meat than Brazilians. So how come cattle drives half of deforestation on the globe? And that in the Amazon has to do with a process that has got to be beautifully called disamazonization. I'm translating here from what many Brazilian local civil society organization folks came up with, because they've recognized that it's not just deforestation, as if it were not enough. You also have the erosion of livelihoods. You have the expulsion of local communities from the landscape, and they typically go to cities and end up living in city slums without, well, without sufficient means. If you go to the outskirts of cities such as Manaus, which is a city of more than 2 million people in the heart of the Brazilian Amazon, that is not even well connected by road. You have to fly there or go by boat. The outskirts are full of people who have moved from the countryside very frequently because they could no longer have a living in the countryside. Sometimes they have been expelled violently. Sometimes they have been bought out, and someone comes to their land with a bag of money, an amount they've never seen in their lives, and say, look, I want to buy your plot. You're not able to do anything prosperous here anyway. Why are you stubborn and keep trying? Modernity is waiting for you over there. Often people will not have access to electricity, let alone modern comforts such as Wi-Fi, indoor plumbing, and other things we take for granted in much of the richer world. So they do go, but of course, once they are there, they're not very well equipped to thrive in the urban setting. Often they will get involved in criminal networks, drug trafficking. Those people frequently end up there because they don't have a livelihood option or their parents didn't, and they ended up growing in such environments. So what's happened, what has been happening here is a process where beef consumption is only part of the story. You see the numbers there of how pasture land has increased. And once again, 3/4 of it since 1990. What a momentous year. We didn't realize back then, those of us who were around. But basically, you have an accumulation, where you can call it primitive accumulation if you want, like Marxist terminology, of land, and in a very stupid way, because it's almost just the land. The biodiversity is just destroyed, bam, with everything that it contains, the potentials and so forth. So it's disamazonized and converted with migrants that come from elsewhere, because, people also struggle to make a living in other parts of the country, or those that do remain but become cattle ranchers. They give up on the livelihoods they used to have and become part of a cattle ranching system that is connected to land mafias, happen to be connected to the beef production sector. But this is much more a process of land grabbing and then land banking and then land price speculation than anything else. You might be starting to wonder how this connects to the whole dietary question I started with, but we'll get there. It's just a long circle. This, for example, is a family of smallholders in the Amazon in Brazil, where the fires have hit. This is a photo I encountered this very morning. And their Brazil nut tree, which was their main source of income, they also grow cassava and collect a couple other things. They don't have access to electricity where they are. Water is expensive, even though you're in in the world's largest river basin. Getting access to clean drinking water is difficult. Those of you who have traveled in the Amazon will know this. And with the fires and with land grabbers that basically come and sometimes saw off a chestnut, not chestnut, sorry, that's how we call it in Brazilian Portuguese, Brazil nut trees. Basically, their livelihood is taken away. They who already lived in poverty. What do you think is going to happen with that boy? You think he's going to remain forever there, just trying to hit a wall? And that's why we need development alternatives. We need development alternatives that obviously this should be a no-brainer, but it is not, as history, recent histories from the 90s has been telling us. Um, we need alternative development pathways or development pathways because I've argued somewhere with colleagues that is not development, that is maldevelopment when basically resources are redistributed inequitably in a way that people are worse off, at least the majority. That's maldevelopment. We need development, and then ideally sustainable development that draws from the bioeconomy, that draws from the Amazon's biocultural wealth, its know-how, its traditions, its expertise accumulated over centuries over the use of certain species in a way that benefits those people to face off the present land uses that have been driving disamazonization, not just soy, but cattle too, which advances to a fair extent because it encounters vulnerable people, such as that father and son, on the way without the ability or the support to thrive economically where they are. And then they end up being kicked out and wiped off the face of the landscape together with the Brazil nut trees. What do those look like? Um, I am citing some of my own publications there just for those of you who may want to know stuff in more detail. That was with some students of mine on herbal medicine promotion. Those are what I call high-hanging fruits. Because when we speak of bioeconomy innovations, we perhaps rightly think big. We think of herbal medicine value chains and look at this gram of the poison of a snake is as much as all this. We think of low volume, high value things, and that's nice. That gets people's eyes this big. But as our study detailed, it of course is quite difficult to get the technology to process that. So we shouldn't think of the bioeconomy only as such high-hanging fruits. And they keep going down. I think cosmetics are much more established and easier for one because you don't need, health checks to the same extent as you would need with medicine and 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 so forth. These are things that are high tech, though. I mean, comparably high tech. We should pursue them, but not think of alternatives only in those terms. There are plenty of lower hanging fruits, and food value chains, of course, play a major role there. I do want to flag, though, that eco and ethnotourism also play a role, and these are things many local communities in the Amazon. I know that around Europe there is a bit of an itch against tourism because we're bombarded with the negative impacts of over tourism, but it doesn't mean that, seu Tião, that man by the window that is a fisherman and is visibly happy with what he does for living, would not welcome, some tourists every now and then that would appreciate hearing about his knowledge and seeing the landscape. So there is a role for that because it's low capital in terms of requirement. It is culturally embedded, and there is greater participation of local people than if you have a pharma company going there to develop something out of the poison of a snake only. All fine with developing stuff from snake poison, but let's not limit ourselves to that. There is definitely a lot that can be done through dietary diversification. How we do that is a conversation that I want to have with you today. In Brazil, for example, we have this policy since 2009 that obliges public schools and public hospitals, prisons, the so-called institutional markets, to purchase a minimum percentage of their food from smallholders, which guarantees, some income for the smallholders, but typically also that those people eat better. And this is very important, for example, for school meals. And in the lower part of the slide, you have Darlene, for example, that organizes a group of women, and there are many of them in Brazil, in the Amazon and elsewhere, producing fruit pulp so that people can hopefully eat ice cream that is not called rainbow, or it's fine to call it rainbow so long as it's not just a bunch of artificial products instead of fruits. We can get fruits of different colors. I'm sure we can get more than the 7 colors of the rainbow. She's holding a bag of what I believe to be acai fruit, but there is so much more. There's so much more. On the right, you see Brazil nut that is collected by the Kayapó indigenous people. We could be having more of those too. It doesn't mean that you have, I mean, you're not even supposed to eat too many Brazil nuts per day. They say something about max 5, I think, but I mean, do check. But there are different things that can be made from that. You don't have to eat them only in natura, because the average European, I came across this data recently, eats about 60 kilos of soy per year. And I'm sure it's not by eating 60 kilos of tofu per year. You get that through processed foods, and in the case of soy, through livestock, through animal foods. But you can get this through foods that are, mildly processed and nutritious to use still. The Amazon, therefore, needs to come to the table. There are so many things. These are different fruits from the Amazon. The lower left one is cupuaçu, which is perhaps the most important thing. Not important. You see, that's a Freudian slip because I really like it, but most delicious thing in creation. You will be a happy person if you get to try it once. Go for it. Those fruits frozen, like murici there, it is um, it is frozen and therefore kept, so it can be sold. It's sold across the country. And most of us, even in Brazil, will not quite know what those fruits are and what they taste like. So the ignorance is not just around the rest of the world. It's in the rest of the country there too. That tells you the scale of what there is to be done. And this is the argument that I want to lodge with you tonight, that the Amazon vanishes because it is not known, and we can hardly value what we don't know. You have baru nut, which is more from the Cerrado than from the Amazon, but much of this would apply to the Cerrado too. And it's some of these species occur throughout South America. And it's a nut, that one you don't have to limit to 5 a day. It's used to fortify breads and foods so that you're not just eating refined wheat with your biscuits. And it's starting to be used even to fortify ice cream. So the food industry can get, to be better to people's health. In the middle, you have pupunha, which is probably something that maybe 99% of you also didn't know to exist, unless there are people from the Amazon in the audience, which I hope there are. And it's not just about eating in natura thing. You have the tapioca, manioc, cassava. It is from the Amazon. It goes deliciously well with some slices of it in the middle. So we can get creative. We can diversify what we eat. And if we link that through trade links, and that's what we call transformative trade. I did not come up with the term. There are researchers that have embraced it and starting to use it, which relates to trade that instead of promoting that kind of devastation, as you saw, because it's focused on a couple of commodities that have nothing to do with the Amazon and arguably should not even be there, replacing that for trade that is on the basis of Amazonian goods so that the money goes to the right place, to the right people that then can help guard it, can help guard the biodiversity that is there, partly by putting some of it to use, but can help guard also their culture so that they don't have to end up leaving like that little family you saw may be about to do because life is too hard for them, because we don't help those of us with the purchasing power and the critical agency in our societies to have some leverage over policymaking because we're not aware of what they do because we're too busy eating ultra processed foods instead. So it can be better for both. I look forward to handling some questions and having a conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Myron. Um, I'm just going to do air hands rather than applaud you, just because that way we save everybody who's wearing headphones from getting a loud crack in their ears right now. But thank you very much for that. Please have a well-deserved drink. Um, Having just spoken for half an hour straight, please also could everybody put their questions into the chat. Now, to start off with, because we are at the Centre for Food Policy here, and you hinted at it, what are the policymaker asks or the things that we should be pushing for, maybe in the UK, maybe internationally, maybe in Sweden, maybe in Brazil, in terms of what are the policymaker asks or the policies we should be pushing for? You hinted at transformative trade, you hinted at different certification, but do you want to expand or start talking and just giving us some firm examples of, in terms of policy, what should we be asking for?
Absolutely. And there are, of course, different dimensions to this. Just before I go on, is it easier if I stop sharing my slides or it doesn't?
Your choice entirely. So I think if you're going to refer to any of your slides or want to go back or forth, please keep them up. But otherwise, you're welcome to just bring it down and we'll just talk with each other
Okay.
as heads in the
Okay.
ether.
Right. So I will refer to just one of
Perfect.
them here. So of course, this is a question that is a lot of material for an entire course, right? What different levers there are for food policy to, let's say, be more virtuous, be part of the solution rather than part of the problem, because I think it's become obvious that food policies that have been part of the problem in letting ultra processed foods become so dominant in wealthy markets that could be using their wealth to promote good in places like the Amazon. It's very unfortunate that there is this mismatch, that this wealth is going to the wrong place to support, things that are detrimental to consumers' own health, missing the opportunity to be eating better while helping people who keep the biodiversity in there. And I'm sure there could be a similar story for different ecosystems. So it depends on the level we analyze. If we think, for example, let me begin from the concrete example of the policy I referred to during my talk of requiring that school meals and other policies in other institutional markets utilize food from from local producers. It is it is a it is pretty much a consensus among local communities in Brazil and smallholders that this has been one of the most important policies to support um, healthier and more sustainable food systems. Um, but its implementation remains challenging because there are cultural issues. You have some patronage networks. For example, when I visited Darlene in their community, her son was about to go to school, and he was complaining that in his school, they're not getting the natural juices that his own mom produces. And she was very upset about that because sometimes he would bring his friends after class to have, what was probably the most delicious murici juice that I ever had. Murici being yet another fruit from the Amazon. There is so much to know. Um, because the city government, the municipal government had not done what it had to implement the policy, and the federal government basically had to chase it. So the implementation is difficult, but this is something transformational and that other places could do. You could always play with that lever and increase the percentage, You need to, of course, support that production. She had a freezer. You remember, you're in the middle of the Amazon, and if you're doing fruit pulp, it, spoils very easily. So you need a freezer. She had a freezer because she got it from the German Development Corporation. Uh, she's very grateful to GIZ, but it definitely should not be depending on, development cooperation from elsewhere in a country that has plenty of money that goes elsewhere. But this is something that could be replicated. One thing, because this is an answer that could carry me for the next 20 minutes, and I don't want to do that. I'm happy to come back and, strengthen particular points or clarify particular points if need be. But one point I will emphasize is that for transformative trade to take off, we have to rethink our urge to be too dogmatic about localized food systems. I say this because I'm familiar with many folks in this realm, people who tend to think about food sustainability and who are very adamant about we have to eat local, eat local, eat local. And I think eating local is great. Um, but that should not prevent us from using our dollars, euros, pounds, whatever you want, and advocating for governments to do that with the public money as well and investors and so forth to support sustainable food production where it needs. I mean, people are happy to have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea in the morning. Maybe they eat a banana or an avocado with a sandwich. They will eat a piece of chocolate at the end of the afternoon when you get that sugar rush. All those things came from far away if you live in Northern Europe, in the UK, in the US. Um, so you should not, therefore, be too shy to involve an Amazonian product just because it also happens to come from far away. Of course, I would say that it's up primarily to, Brazilians elsewhere in there to consume more of Amazonian products because that can create already a robust market. But oftentimes, for social political reasons, it is consumers in wealthier societies that tend to be more alert to food sustainability problems. Plus, Brazilians are bombarded with daily agribusiness propaganda, so it's a fierce competition there. Sometimes it's easier to advocate for this consumption in Europe than it is in Brazil, surprisingly enough. So, so I think we,
Well,
we have to be open for that. Go ahead.
can I come in here? So you've touched on two other questions and then skirted around them. So I'm going to hold you to another of the questions, if that's at all. And it's
Please.
amazing that you brought up the 30% question, the 30% policy that is throughout. So 30% of school meals has to come from local farms. It's been transformative. We look at it within our Masters of Food Policy as a really innovative piece of work. And I've done research looking at the environmental impacts of what that does to public school procurement. It's amazing. But that's in Brazil. And you started to drift, and I'm going to hold you to this drift that you started towards what do we do in Europe? What do we do in the global north? Because those are changes, as you've highlighted, that people in Brazil need to make. So what do we need to make here so what do policymakers need to do within the global north at the country level? Is this about putting it into school procurement here? Is it about ensuring certifications or standards? What are these other levers that we should be at least looking at in the global north around this? Because this is a long-term change. How can we support these big changes from the distance that we're at?
Thank you for helping me to double down on that scope, on that area, because indeed there is more to say about that. I think one advantage of many societies in well, North America, Northern Europe, and I'm not being too strict when I say Northern Europe. I'm including the likes of the UK, Germany, whatever is to the north of Southern Europe. Um, is that there is a certain openness to innovate in food consumption. It's where people will speak about burgers made of insect protein eh, and the likes, all sorts of things. But I summon us who live in this part of the world or who are concerned about that to try to demand, and I'm going to unpack this in a moment, to demand for natural innovation. I mean, we've definitely had enough of artificial food innovation. So it is about, and there are different levers where to put our hand to do that. It is about promoting that innovation through bio-based goods that are biodiversity friendly and based on biodiversity. And if they come from ecosystems where that is critically needed, as is the case of the Amazon, all the more important, because then we're doing good not just to ourselves. Now, how do we do that? I think there are a few levers. I don't think it's much about school meals, though there can be a role for that. In Sweden, for example, children get their meals at the school. I mean, you don't have to send food with your kids to school. They get fed, and they get fed with different things. And on occasion, there will be something that comes from overseas. Why not including some baru nut in their meals? It could be a form of connecting them to where that comes from. And suddenly you link that to the Amazon and to the Cerrado. Did they know what the Cerrado is? They may get 40 years old without knowing. Now they will have eaten it. So you can do that. You can also engage with retailers, which I think are critical players here, to offer more of this, because in such societies where the food culture is a bit more malleable, arguably, than in places that have very deeply ingrained traditional food cultures, you will find the readiness from many consumers to try out. They don't try out frequently because they don't know it exists. They don't know it exists because nobody has told them and because they don't find it. I mean, I showed you some of these fruits. Maybe some people here in the audience are already asking, okay, where can I get that? Well, you can't unless you go there. Why can't you? Because the trade links are not established. So how come they're established for, certain things, but not others? And again, I insist. I was in Japan a few months ago, which is a place most will agree has a very traditional food culture. And there, during my breakfast, I chanced upon acerola soda, acerola being an Amazonian fruit. Too bad it was fake acerola because it was just the flavor of it, an artificial drink. Why not give people the real thing?
A really useful point there, and hopefully you took photos of that for a slide deck in the future. You've started to touch on some questions from Tom Divney. So he's asked two questions, and one of them you've touched on in terms of the critical actions we need around local value chains. So you highlighted schools and public procurement, and you also highlighted retailers and needing to actually engage retailers there. But his second part is what I want to press you on. So Tom then goes on to ask, if we're thinking about climate change, food availability due to climatic shocks is going to get worse in the global north before it gets better, before we readjust our climate systems. So he's wanting to know, is it economically and environmentally feasible to be depend on consumer demand in the north for these fantastic but unknown products? Is this a feasible way to go? Just to push you on that narrative there, is this something, because climate change will be affecting the Amazon as well? Is this a value chain we can develop and actually rely on?
Thanks for that question. His warning is, of course, sober and correct. There is however, a catalyst role that can be played at any rate. It's not uncommon for societies in the global south to mimic whatever becomes fashionable in the global north. It is a role that I think many of you may not be even aware of. Uh, so, by making something attractive, by making something, well, trendy, to put it bluntly, can then get possibly South American consumers to jump on it. And I think if we scan our heads, we may find examples of that. I don't have any particular one coming to mind here, but
So,
I'm sure it could.
well, I guess the not that directionality, but I guess Emily Burson in the chat's talking about acai. But
Mhm.
again, that's not that flip. There's a difference there, of course. But
Yes, of course. And acai is a great example of something that was mainly unknown to
hmm
non-Amazonian Brazilians up until 25 years ago. And then, of course, everybody is now trying to replicate Asai's story. And basically, what happened in a nutshell was that many of you may know that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a thing. And in the 90s, there were Jiu-Jitsu fighters that were pretty good and they kept winning. And people wanted to know, what do these guys eat? How can they be so good? And they looked into what they eat, what they ate, and it involved cassava flour with acai. And it's like, whoa, what the heck is that? And then gyms started to make that available for people doing workouts, and from there it spiraled out. First within Brazil, and now it's taken the world. Even in my neighborhood here in the outskirts of Stockholm, I find it. I just wanted to take the chance to add that many people will be quick to point out that, oh, look at it, acai now is also being grown as a plantation, so we've ruined it. That's throwing the baby away with the bathwater. If you go ask Darlene or many people there, they're very happy that acai now sells much better and provides them with very important income. It doesn't mean that there are some production systems that are better than others, some that are more inclusive than others, but the answer definitely cannot be let's then just go back to our potatoes because we've put our hands in acai and now we ruined it. That's not the case. It's far better than the cattle and soy duo that's been wrecking the Amazon apart.
interesting. Thank you for that. And I guess thank you for expanding on that. And I think we did cover there also that the the previous question just on in terms of is it ecologically sustainable to actually be pushing these? Because so you highlighted that as well, didn't we? Just double checking we went through that. Um,
Mhm.
so Patty Rundal has asked a series or put a series of statements about Codex Alimentarius, which is the global
Mhm.
trade platform, and kind of is just pushing you because you've used the ultra processed food narrative,
Yes.
and she is talking about uh, non-government organizations and what they should be lobbying into the codex in this area because
Yes.
NGOs are one of the groups who can observe, but also
Yes.
wanting to push back on you and highlight that global trade involves processing in some way, even if that's just freezing. And a lot of global trade, if it's acai, is powdered acai, which is ultra processing. So
Mhm.
how does your argument actually stack up to more diversity, even if it is ultra processed diversity?
No, very good question. I mean, not all the processing is ultra processed. For instance, frozen acai, like what she's holding there, it's definitely very different than powdered or different from the acerola fake drink that I had in Japan. These are very different things. Of course, that might be heavy to send to Europe. It might be expensive, but that we can look into. It's not necessarily artificial. I think there is a line to be drawn there. Um, and we cannot put it all in the same basket just because it experienced some level of processing. After all, we bring, bananas in bulk and large quantities and other heavy goods. So we could also bring other fruits. So, and basically minimal processing in that case. Why just one fruit? So we are ready to put our money, our daily dollar to support banana plantations in what used to be banana republics, we can therefore do better by, promoting biodiverse republics if only we distribute our consumption as a society, not just as an individual, across more species. And that's the key way to avoid having acai become, we don't want acai republics. But if you have 50 species of that, and of course have the right incentives in place, and that's more down to the national and subnational level, to promote inclusive systems of mixed farming and polyculture, then you're on the right track. I don't know if I answered all the dimensions there, but
You
please.
answered quite a bit. We didn't touch on codex, but that is fine. But I think there's another question in the chat which just adds to that. And this would, sorry, we're pressing you here. We love the
That's all right.
audiences here really love to ask
Bring it
hard
on.
questions, as you can see. So Emily Burton, who is an alumni of this, and I think did her value chain analysis on, it was on avocados. It wasn't on acai, wasn't it, Emily? So in the module, which this is, you are part of the reading list of, students do a value chain analysis of different
Mhm.
products and look at the political economy. And she's pushing for the question of, is it worth losing the authenticity of food to establish more transformative trade? And so she highlights that acai in the global north is eaten with a lot of sugar in a totally different way to what we eat now. And again, you use the narrative of chocolate coming from, early modern periods to now, and we added a lot of sugar to it, which brought down the price, made it a lot less healthy. And the same narrative you could say is happening to acai. Is it worth losing the authenticity of the food way in order to create transformative trade?
The short answer is yes. Forgive me for the bluntness, because I think authenticity can exist in multiple ways. Take avocado, for example. As a Brazilian, I regard it as a fruit. My North American fellows will regard it as a vegetable. For me, eating avocados with salt, as my beloved Mexicans, and I love Mexico, is quite weird. I can handle it if I'm there. And then I offer them an avocado shake, the way in Brazil we have it, and it's native across the board. And they find like, ooh, what's this with sugar? It's like, yes, it's a. So it can be authentic in different ways. I mean, often there is not one single way to consume it. The acai example actually applies within Brazil too, because outside of the Amazon, we have it the way it's found here in Stockholm or in London is pretty much the same way you will find in Sao Paulo. And I think they in the Amazon will still appreciate that acai is consumed. They're less concerned and less picky about people changing the way they're going to eat things. People in Europe don't eat potatoes the same way Andean indigenous people ate potatoes 500 years ago, and so on and so forth. But those people will still appreciate that there is a demand for something that keeps forests standing and that allows them to maintain their livelihoods. I think in the hierarchy of things they care about, that is much higher, that she's able to feed her son and give him education and eventually have him or his daughter, her daughter, uh, you know, taking that forward rather than moving to the city, rather than the fact that acai is being eaten differently. Then they will say, you go to the Amazon, as when I or others go to the Amazon, then you try the real thing, and maybe you like it, maybe you don't, but then it becomes a cultural experience. Maybe then you can do the tourism part of the bioeconomy too by going there.
Good points. Again, just wanting to put those harder questions to you, but some good answers there in terms of if we're thinking of this as a de-ammonization, no, stopping
Desamazonization.
de-ammonization, sorry, methodology, using the bioeconomy, using food to stop deforestation in the Amazon. These are the things that have to be considered. Uh, Again, this is you're talking, and so your hypothesis is switching away from livestock farming, or there's more to your thesis than that. Are there any other things you want to highlight that we've not touched on? I'm aware we have about 5 minutes left before we have to head off. So it's just there's one or two other questions, but are there any other aspects or things you thought we would be bringing up in this discussion?
No, I think I would just reiterate the importance of coming up with even a research agenda about giving more comprehensive answers to some of what was asked in terms of what the levers are, and I think some of those came from you, Christian. What the levers are, I spoke about retailers, I spoke about what could eventually come to take place in school meals in a country like Sweden. But we should be doing a scanning, a mapping of what those levers are, which actors hold decision-making power, and it's not just governments. We
Hmm.
don't have to expect Brussels and London to do that necessarily or only. And we need to scan that to think of how do value chains come about? I mean, with the
Mm.
chocolate, we'll go back to a long story, but with the avocados that became such a thing in the last 15 years, why? What was behind that? How can we replicate that success story to a set? Because much of the problem begins when there is a hyper focus on just one crop. How can we replicate some of the lessons there and learn to play with it so that we
Hmm.
can suddenly increase demand for 25 different things that would probably be enough to support a lot of livelihoods in the Amazon and create also in consumer countries the culture of having a diverse natural diet. I think it's for us to explore further.
No, and again, definitely something we would love to explore further. Let's hopefully can have you back at Food Thinkers in a few years, and we'll be looking at where that is now. But for now, I'll wrap this session of Food Thinkers up. I'm going to do jazz hands again instead of an applause. But thank you, Myron. It has been a lovely pleasure having you here discussing this today. Thank you to everybody in the chat for asking such insightful questions. See you all in January for Dr. Dolly Van Tulleken, and have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Bye for now.
Thank you, Christian. Thanks, everybody.
Okay,
Merry Christmas.
bye.